Hello there, I'm Mystic. Welcome to my new podcast where I have a new conversation with a guest every single day. And they all have some pretty passionate things to say about the state of the world. So join us today, subscribe, like, and share wherever you listen to us, and tell us your opinions. We may have you on the show. Oh, and remember, always have fun. Hello, and welcome to my Mystic podcast. I am so grateful to all you listeners all over the world who are currently listening in. I am so grateful to introduce my dear friend, Rey Calderon, and he is literally in the southernmost area of California today during this global pandemic. And he is an attorney and a community activist, and I'm so grateful to have him on the show. Welcome, Rey.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes, of course, and thank you for being here. So, yeah, how are you feeling right now? Before we get into it, how are you doing?
Um, it's complicated. I feel like on the one hand, I feel like I'm blessed. I have a job. I have a place to live, so I'm not having it as hard as a lot of other people are having it. But it's also weird because I'm separated from my husband and my dogs, and except for FaceTime, it's a little bit lonely.
Yeah. Lonely is the understatement, right? Because everything is in a state of flux. We don't know what, and unfortunately, this is a very crazy time for all of us. And so you guys FaceTime every single day?
Yeah, usually a couple times a day. Um, yeah, every day.
And where does he find himself now?
So we have a place in Tijuana, and the and that's where he and my dogs are at. I normally it's difficult all year round, even before the pandemic. I normally visit him on the weekends, but right now because the border's closed down, I can't. But it's not far geographically, but because of the border, it's really separated.
Right. And so how long does it take you to visit with him? Like how long, like what is it, 20 minutes away? Is it half an hour away?
Going in, it's about a half an hour away, but coming out, it can range anywhere from an hour to 4 hours to try to cross the border coming back.
So it's contingent on the car lines, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I go through a medium faster lane than there's three lanes. There's one that's they call it a sentry, kind of like a global passport lane. The second is people who've crossed many times and you're already on file, and so it's a little bit faster. And then there's the average tourist crosser with no background information. And so the middle lane, that's the faster lane. You can do 5 hours easy on the other lanes, but luckily it's a little bit pared down. But yeah, it's hit or miss. Sometimes it could be an hour, sometimes it could be 4 hours.
And that's coming back, but obviously going into Mexico, it's about half
Yeah,
an
the time,
hour.
yeah, if you're off peak, there's like a million people who cross the border every day for
Or
work
used to,
yeah,
correct?
used to cross the border every day. And there's still a lot of them there's if they're essential workers, but yeah, and a million people cross every day during traffic hour, uh peak hours, because
And so
that can
what
get
you do
crazy.
is not considered essential?
Yeah, so I do have an essential worker permit, and that does allow me to have because I work in I'm a community activist and a lawyer, but we work through we're doing a lot of non-for-profit social service work, helping people who are dealing with the crisis right now. So I actually do have a what we call freedom papers,
Wow.
to be able to so that police don't stop you. And
Uh-huh.
if they do stop you, you have a reason to be, in a place of business or things like that. And also that it's good to cross the border. The problem is I also have my 86-year-old grandmother living with me, and we we theoretically, it would be great if the three of us were just down in Tijuana, we hunkered down and did everything by the internet. But if she were to get sick, God forbid, all her healthcare is over here, and so it would be really complicated. Every minute counts when you're 86 years old to get healthcare. So we decided that even me trying to cross, and again, even then it's kind of up in the air because they're going to say, well, why are you crossing if your job's on the other side? If you're not going to do this every day, do you live in Mexico? So if I lived in Mexico permanently, it'd be easier. But because I actually have my residence in the States, it's more complicated. You actually have to get a visa and all these other things if you stay there past 7 days. So basically, we're stuck. We're separated.
Even though you're married, you can't get those permanent papers. You can't be dual citizen right now.
So I could. It's really actually tough. I have a who he and his spouse are in the same situation, and he got Mexican papers, but it took him many years to try to figure that out. Um, and if everything works out, we have 2 more years on an exclusion from the United States, and so like we're probably likely to he's more likely to come back into the country before we actually. So the bureaucracy in Mexico is even slower than the bureaucracy in America.
Wow. So you would have to probably pay somebody off to help expedite those papers. And even if you did, it sounds like it would still be an extended amount of time. Is that correct?
Yeah, and we'd be going through and agencies in Baja California. First off, I would never do that. But second, the corruption here is a little bit different than other parts of Mexico. Where my husband's from, you could literally just offer a couple bucks to anybody to get a passport or anything like that. Whereas in Baja, it's a lot more strict because of all the Americans and because the government is under more of a microscope here.
Right, right. So you could actually travel to a place deeper into Mexico, the country, and obtain papers. They would be legal. You would just be paying to help expedite it.
Yeah,
Um,
it used to be kind of easy like that. It's gotten more complicated, and then you're also depending on where you're going. Like my husband's town. I don't even for the last is it 3 or 4 years I haven't gone back to his town because I used to go all the time. And then he's from the town in Guerrero, Mexico, which is where they massacred and disappeared all those 44 students. It was international news.
mhm.
Town where he's from. So I'm actually not even
Wow.
trying to go deep Mexico where he pitched. Um, it's yeah. No thanks.
Well, plus the values, as seen, generally speaking, of course, I can't make a blanketed statement. I just want to just be completely clear that some individuals might be a little bit more conservative and see your type of marriage as something that's not plausible in their eyes.
So oddly enough, where he's from, that isn't as much of a deal. It's actually really it was a counterintuitive for me. So when I started going out there, that like in fact, some parts of rural southern Mexico are the only way to put it is they're super gay. they have,
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
there's like gay clubs in his little rural town. Um,
What? That's
not
you that's like the antithesis of what I was
uh,
thinking.
no, it's interesting. There is a group of sort of I would call them more the evangelical crowd that is just like in the United States, just homophobic. You get some pressure from those folks, but the government's actually pretty secular on a lot of stuff, and they don't get as much into those debates. I think the biggest social fight right now in Mexico is just women's rights. Women are protesting. They're actually rioting. They're like it's really intense. That I would say that gender is more of a thing and less sexuality per se, if that makes any sense.
No, it doesn't. Because from my I'm gonna be honest with you, from my personal experience of Latin America is that Latin America is very you know, Republican in their values,
Hmm.
to put it that way. And so to hear what you're saying, that these small rural towns are more open to gay marriages, and not as open to women's rights, doesn't make any sense. But hey, that's what's happening, correct?
Yeah, kind of. I would say that's somewhat correct. I think it's not that they oppose women's rights per se. I don't think they come out saying, "Hey, we want women not to have rights." Like some people say, we don't want gays to marry. But you just have an entrenched sort of male patriarchy that is unquestioned. And so I think what's happening right now is
Oh,
women are just questioning it, and it's gotten to the point where they're like, because there's been, I mean, there's places in Mexico, just like other parts of Latin America, where there's like mass murders of women, right? There's like all of these women
yeah.
who've died. And so I think, honestly, I think women have had it up, just up to their neck, and they just can't take it anymore. I mean, I've been watching some of the videos in Mexico. You don't see it. You see the protests here in Tijuana too, by the way. I've seen them in person, but like in some parts, they're like, I mean, they're burning stuff. This is old school, like watch riots kind of stuff. Um,
And this was prior to the pandemic,
and that
obviously.
was prior to the pandemic. So yeah, it's an interesting. I've actually never had a problem with being gay in Mexico. I've had more. I would say I've had more discrimination here in the States.
That just seems so counterintuitive, just like you said. And you've heard of John Peters. Do you know who I'm talking about?
No, refresh my memory.
Yeah, John Peters. And he actually is trying to tell people to wake up in regards to our values, family values, have been derailed in this country.
Oh, I know what you're talking about
And
now. Yeah.
yeah, specifically for men and how men's rights
Hmm.
and how they're being marginalized, and there's no place. They feel like there's no place for them, and he's trying to wake up men. And interestingly enough, there's also women who are listening to him. And he keeps saying, you have to wake up, take responsibility, and become a man.
Right.
What do you say to that?
So I've actually followed a lot of this stuff, not his stuff per se, but other. I mean, over the years, it's this is a tough one. I'm not a very partisan person, and I'm not a ideological person, so I don't fall into a camp like I'm a socialist, and I'm not extreme libertarian. Like I don't have those monikers. So like I see points on both sides. The point I would say is that first, as a matter of everyday everything, like I'm sorry, women, make less money than men. Men a lot of times get the benefit of the doubt. Men can, particularly white men. I shouldn't say all men because black and brown men don't always get that privilege. But maybe compared to, right. But the I would say that they're you have people like, I don't know, like candidates for president that who've never done jack, who sound cool and charming, and they're young white men, and so they get an automatic like bump into the top tier of things. And I think men get that much more frequently. So I think to say that men are oppressed, or to imply that, is kind of whack. But I also think on the other hand, there are some weird statistics and things that, and there are sort of contexts where there is sort of a you have to think about like rearing of young men. So for example, you know, black and brown men, particularly black men, are more likely to die from anything. Whatever you pick, we're more likely to die from it, right? There are all
Mm-hmm.
these statistics that are crazy. So, like, to say that men in general have, you know, have this problem, I would say that it's certainly true for black and brown men that we have a, societal uh, detriment to us. So we don't want to like denigrate black and brown men, lift black and brown men in particular, right? Because we actually get denigrated by everything every day. um, Something. I also think that depending on the context, there's, and I say this of my own people because I'm a bit of a liberal. Like I said, I'm not very ideological, but you have
Mm-hmm.
these extremes, right? So you have like the right extreme, which is closer, I think, to the Peters thinking, which is, men used to be
And
this.
it's Jordan Peterson. I just want to
Jordan, okay.
amend that and say it's Jordan
Ah,
Peterson.
well,
I
that's why you threw
apologize.
me
Yeah,
off.
it's Jordan
That's what
Peterson.
threw me
Yeah,
off.
I apologize for that. That was my fault.
All
Yeah,
good.
entirely my fault.
All good. But oh, sorry about that. So I would say that, you on the one hand, you've got a movement, like like these promise seekers kind of people, right? You have a movement of people who say, hey, traditionally men used to be, breadwinners and protectors and hunters and all these things, and we've removed that from the male equation. And so what is it that we're trying to groom men to be now? Is there something in the gender specific that maybe we're denying because of some, abstract philosophy? Like, they usually,
And that's
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, that's exactly what he's saying.
Yeah.
That's exactly what Jordan is saying, and I find him quite interesting sociologically
Right.
because he says that men, and white men in particular, have no place to be men, and that being a woman, if women can allow themselves to be a woman, a man can be a man, irrelevant of, um, and let's say female energy
Yeah.
and male energy. I think that's an easier way to digest it. But when you have these systems in place right now that don't allow for values and the family and all these things that Jordan is pointing out to, then it leads to the decline of society, which is what he's trying to point to.
So
And that's why the United States did not do well, quote unquote.
yeah, I think that's a little bit over the top, but I think there's a grain of truth in it. What I'm trying to say, it's not that it's patently false because it's true. You do see that, and there are, especially for anybody who's old enough, we can remember different generations, right? Like my parents are boomers. It's like I kind of know.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I always respected and loved my grandfather because he was a stable person. He worked. He paid off his house. He, provided for the family. My grandmother was a domestic, right? So, for the house, she took care of the house, and so like those kinds of things, I don't see there's anything fundamentally wrong with that if people want to be in those situations, right? And I think where the extremes come in is you've got people like promise seekers who say, well, the Bible says, right, that men are dominant, women should obey their husbands, all those things, and you get to an extreme where like there's no choice in the matter, right? You're supposed to do this by divine law, the Torah says this or whatever, and then the
Mm-hmm.
other extreme is sort of like, you know, extreme leftist academia, which is, and I've seen this myself, where, and it's not just gender, but it's like, I think if you get an extreme left context, particularly if you're a student at a university, for example, you've got people who've studied for years and years about, oppression of minorities, oppression of women. And then instead of trying to balance that and add perspectives, they go deep left and like, denigrate men, right, as these evil patriarchal sort of
Exactly.
figures. And you
Exactly.
also have that, I think, even just with our own people, like with Latinos, right? It's just like, well, if you study colonialism enough and you study the shit that's happened to us in Latin America enough, at some point you start hating Europeans, right? But if you have that context, and then if it's all about sort of the taking down anything positive about Europeans, then you get to a situation where, if you're a white guy going to school now, not that you're not being necessarily just educated on the horrors and being taught to sort of be a better person. You're actually being sort of attacked as a symbol of all of the past evils. And so those are the extremes, right?
Right.
I just don't think most settings are in those extremes. I think average people deal with all kinds of craziness, and I think there is, there's room to be in the middle. And that's kind of how I approach everything. It's like, like, well, what is it that makes sense and what it doesn't make sense, right? So I think there needs to be an outlet for young men. I saw some statistics. I can't quote them right now, but I know I saw some statistics not too long ago about the increasing suicide rate of young men. Um,
Yeah, that's been prevalent and that's been
yeah,
happening for the last 10 years.
yeah. So those are things that I think to be on alert. There should be an alarm being raised, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that, and therefore, women shouldn't continue to try to get equal rights, right? Like that doesn't. It's a false dilemma. I don't think you have to choose.
Right, that's interesting. That's an interesting way of looking at it. Um, I think that when individuals don't choose, and of course, I'm not saying choose one way or the other, because yes, we live in a dualistic natured type of reality, but at the same time, I feel that there's a place for everybody. And yeah, the old way, the old paradigm of doing things is has eroded. I can't even say is. It has eroded. And we literally are stepping into a new paradigm. And what type of world are we going to create? And I don't even want to say recreate, because then you're taking the old, and then just swirling that up and making something new. But rather, from all the wisdom and experiences which lead to the wisdom that we all have, we can collectively come together and create a whole different type of paradigm. That's where we're at. And I think that if people could, in their homes while they're in quarantine, really think about what's important for them, perhaps maybe by writing it down and praying or meditating or whatever it is each individual does, then collectively we can come together and really try to create something new in this world, well, United States and globally, really. um I can't say one world government. That's what they're that's what they're pushing for. And how do you feel about a one world government?
I don't have a lot of love for bureaucracies in government in general. I think when you try to centralize things, it gets complicated. I think a one world government is kind of nightmarish because uh, it, I think you would really just coalesce all this the international global special interests, multinational corporations would pretty much own that. And we already have that problem on local, federal level, and even state levels. I mean, imagine a one world government. I mean, I don't can't think of any protective barrier that people in the respective countries could actually, exercise to hold those folks accountable. I just think it's a crazy, terrible idea. I think it sounds great. It sounds like the League of Nations or the United Nations, but all of those things have been, sort of failures because we have too many individual power figures with more wealth that you know, have taken it over. Right? The United Nations is powerless because there's a handful of powerful nations that have vetoes on everything. Right? I don't think you could do it. I just think it'd be too tough.
It's interesting because I had somebody a couple weeks ago on the podcast who worked for the United Nations, and he absolutely abhorred the idea based on his experiences of having worked for the United Nations. He said, "This is deplorable. This is not acceptable. It's never going to work based on my experiences." And well, he said some other things, and I guess people could listen to that podcast. But I thought Jay was a really, really interesting guest to have on the show. And so tell me a little bit more about your community activism. What is it centered around?
Well, I've done different things my whole career. I most recently got involved with an organization that does a mix of issues. We're multi-issue, so we work with communities to help engage them. So there's civic engagement, there's some legal advocacy, there are a very limited amount of social services, and we, right now, for example, I'm working on trying to hold the government accountable at the border. The kind of practices that are happening with detentions and the thing that's happening right now with the ICE detentions and the actual kids in cages here at the border and the southern border here is just it's awful. There are people being infected. They Just the
Mm.
other day, they were pepper spraying some of the people there because they were protesting because they don't have any protective equipment and there's no separation. They're piled up on each other inside cages. I mean,
Wow.
it's like shoulder to shoulder at best. And
Wait, what do you mean cages? Can you, yeah, take the time to share that? Because obviously you see it day in and day out, and I apologize, but you know, most of the listeners do not. They have no clue, and unfortunately, we're at this time right now. You know, we're being fed fake news.
yeah, so what the United States has done, and you can actually Google and find some reputable sources that will there are actually images all over the internet. But the United States used to have a policy is that if you try to cross the border illegally, one, they would get you and throw you back. But
Hmm.
they now what they do is they want to make sure that you're in the system so that if you ever do get in, they can hold it against you as a criminal act and prevent you from ever becoming legalized. And so
It's a felony, correct?
I don't know if it's actually I can't remember because I actually don't do immigration law per se. I do most of the election law. But
Okay.
I would say
Okay.
so I don't want to be quoted on that, but I would say that it is a at least a factor that could bar you from coming in later. And so they want to catch those people and have them in the system, have their fingerprints and their pictures and all these other things. So they'd rather do that, right? And then which costs a lot of money. It creates a lot of time, and then they have to detain people largely, and a lot of these are private immigration detention centers brought to you by the same people who build private prisons in the United States, people like GeoCorp, and others like the Corrections Corporation of America. And they lobby really heavily to build more and more detention centers and private prisons. And so there's actually a industry that's making money off of detention, just like regular prisons, private prisons. There's an incentive to lock as many people up as possible. There's money changing hands.
So
Um,
people get paid. Wait, hold on a second. So are you saying that individuals get paid to lock people up?
so you don't get a bonus for locking people up. I mean, you may just be regular, officer with the Customs and Border Patrol,
And
but
nice, yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, but there's ICE and then there's the CBP and there's different levels of officers. So there's all of these Border Patrol officers. You're just going to get your regular salary, right? But the companies making prisons and making detention centers get paid by occupancy. So there's an economic incentive to lock more and more
Uh,
people up. And those people lobby the government. It's a vicious cycle, right? They pay into people's campaigns. As I tell people, I debated this professor in Mexico City on the radio once about corruption, and I told her, the United States is more corrupt than Mexico, and she thought I was like psycho. And I said, you know why? Because in Mexico, at least they still put up a front. The cash is exchanged behind closed doors, in bags of cash. And in the United States, we just legalized bribery, right? You can just write checks to people's campaigns and say, hey, we need more prisons. And that's what happens. So people are detained, but because of the high number of asylum seekers in particular, so folks coming
uh-huh.
from, largely from Central America, like Honduras and other countries, Guatemala,
Hmm.
they with traditional asylum, right? The caravans, as people have seen on TV, they're coming and asking for asylum, which is a whole different thing. It's not illegal immigration, right? The law says you can seek asylum, right? But when you cross and you ask for asylum, they want to distinguish between who's who. They want to put them in the system, and like I said, there's an economic incentive to detain people. So they throw people either back if they after they process, but the people who are backlogged are stuck in these detention centers. And these aren't formal long-term detention centers. These are like basically fenced-in cages, um,
Wow.
and they're all, I mean, they're like overcrowded. Think of it like the drunk tank at a county jail on a Saturday night, right? It's just like basic of each other. So it's there's images everywhere about it. I mean, there's been a lot of good investigative journalism on the problem, but that is a recipe for disaster. And we've already had multiple people be infected by the virus. There's even CBP, Border Patrol agents have been infected in every single center in the country that does border enforcement. It's a complete disease to ticking time bomb, and the Border Patrol is just still implementing really bad policies. So what we do is call attention to that. We do press releases. We work with legislators. We work with other community activists. We help expose some of the things that are happening. Like they pepper sprayed a whole group of these people, like I said on last week, because they were protesting and asking for protective gear, and they were
And of course
afraid that
that
they were.
didn't happen. Of course that
No,
didn't.
no, of course not. And they're afraid that they're going to die because there are people infected and they're in these cages, right? They're in these like detention like
A
areas, but
detention
we're
center.
not.
No, no, no. It's right. That's a detention
Yeah.
center, and it's like it
Well, there's
smells
detention center,
of.
there's regular detention, and then there's these temporary cages where people have been. Also, by the way, the sanitary conditions have been problematic. They people were not getting toothbrushes or able to wash. Like, I mean, really, not just the COVID. Think about other things like
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
hepatitis A. There's so many
yeah.
other things that could pass through there.
Right, 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 right. And that's obviously a cause for concern. And these are human beings, and they're being treated like cattle. And it smells of like the Japanese detainment and camps that we had in this
Well,
country.
yeah, and a lot of people, try to give flack to AOC for this. And, whenever you think about AOC, 'cause I'm not a super fan of hers, but she was right. She called them concentration camps, and that's really what they are.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so here, I have to play the devil's advocate because, these people are unfortunately coming to the United States illegally.
No, that's not accurate. There are some, that's true. And most of these are people who are coming to
Well,
seek
wait a second.
asylum,
The
which is
people,
legal.
right? No, I get that, but the people that there are some people, okay, that are coming to this country illegally. And how do you feel about that? Because there's a system put in place that people can actually enter this country legally.
Yeah, so that's always interesting. I mean, there are people who are like, depending on what country you're from, who have are on like 98-year waiting list. So how the efficiency of that system is just odd to me. I think, but let's just say that an average person who's coming here, why are they coming, right? There's some people who
And
shouldn't be
not
here.
just, and let me
Yeah.
amend that, not just from Mexico, because there's people
No,
coming to the United States all over the
majority of people,
world.
the
Wait,
majority of people
hold on.
are from Central America
There
now.
there's people coming to the United States from all over the world, and a lot of them, the majority of the people coming into this country are coming illegally. And there's people from Poland, there's people from China, there's people from India, I mean literally from all over the world. Yet we see, and it's not only Central America and Southern America. I mean, it's literally just Mexico. And I don't know if they're lopping people and saying, "Oh yeah, that Mexican," as
Yeah,
opposed to
so
saying there's 26 Latin American countries, people. And there's countries all over the world that are also coming here illegally. So I just had to get that in because, I mean, what's going on here?
agreed, agreed. I think there's a lot of people coming. I mean, you get people here at the border from Brazil, from China, from India. I mean, there's a lot of different people. I'd say the vast majority of people who are detained in these cages are Central American or Mexican. Mexican immigration has actually dropped sharply over the last like 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're getting right now is people fleeing Central America. So you could say, well, why are they coming here illegally? That's a big problem. They should stay in their own country. It's not our problem. Well, the United States, if it weren't our problem, we wouldn't put our hands so much in their governments and get involved in their elections and support or not support their dictators. And
Right. It's
we,
called NAFTA. It's called NAFTA. They use NAFTA.
what's
Go ahead.
well, NAFTA is one of them. I think it's also just
Hmm.
what we
But
do with,
it
yeah.
started with NAFTA. It started with NAFTA back in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I would say it's exacerbated. I mean, we've done stuff for a very long time, going all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine. We've had our hands in everybody's business. I mean, come on, look at Puerto Rico. I mean, it's like
Oh, don't
we
get
do
me
a
started.
I mean, it's much older than that. I think NAFTA just created different avenues, but I think it's much older than that. But anyways, and I think that if you're gonna destabilize a country to create better you know conditions for economic reasons like you're alluding to, people, and then you have social breakdown, and you have basically a lack of safety and order, and people are getting murdered and by death squads and things, and people are going to try to get out. I mean, why do most people come to leave their countries? Sometimes it's just because they want better opportunities, but a lot of times they're fleeing really bad places. And I would say that certainly it's not the United States' responsibility to just be allow everybody in fleeing anything that's happening in the world. But if you look at the people who are trying to get in, it's the people we have we have literally ruined their countries and their governments. I mean, Europe has the same problem. Europe has a huge, huge wave of it had multiple waves of African immigration, right, in particular, and Indian immigration. And these are all people who were colonized by European countries, right? We went in, sucked up all the resources. Well, Europe went in and sucked up all the resources, destabilized their own social order,
Hmm.
put superimposed Western democracies, and those haven't worked well because they've been basically dictatorships. And then with except a few exceptions, and then people can't find food, which is ridiculous. And so they want to go to France, right? Because they speak French, or they want to go back to a place where they are connected to. Like there's a few Italian spots, right? It's like, okay, well, they're doing all right. They're still doing all right, right? And so I want to go to Europe, and then they're like, oh no, we can't have you here. We don't need you. It's like you're gonna be a tax in our economy. But like, I'm sorry, like you got a responsibility to Africa. Look what the French did to the Congo.
Right. But at the same time, I mean, there's so many people that we can allow into the country before, you know, this country goes to shit. Not that it's not there now. We don't know, right? Because our economy right now is being completely destroyed. And prior to it, this country was doing really, really well and on a great economic roadmap. But now unfortunately, it's being destroyed, and not just our economy, but the global economy. And a lot of people have leaned on the U.S. For that. And so, there's the economy. They're running from economic states that are deplorable, religious freedom, which we have in this country. Well, I hope we still have that,
Yeah.
because who knows, right? Um, but there's a myriad of reasons as to why people are coming. But I think that yes, I understand that it can take years and years and years to do it legally, and so some of the options are to come here illegally, and it's a challenging situation right now. And I
So
still don't understand why, um, you know, Mexico is being targeted, and the fleeing of people is because a lot of people in the government of Mexico, and maybe you can tell me this, oh, they were giving monies to people to come back to go back to Mexico, um, and open a business.
there's been a lot of brain drain in Mexico. A lot of their best people have come to the States, and I mean, you get anyone who's if you're in a rural town in Mexico, it's just like the United States. You're in a small town, you're going to go to New York, right? And try to look for
Mm-hmm.
opportunities. And I think that's happened with these countries, right? Between the two countries. So they've tried to get more people to I think there was like a Paisano program, right? Countryman program where they were trying to like people, feel nostalgic about Mexico. But it's I think that's right. I think the more of the most talented and hungry people that leave Mexico, the worse Mexico is going to be. And so you've got to get people to stay. Now, that brings up a point though, and I think this is important because when we're talking about, economics, right? We're talking about actual economics. The United States has been competitive and has had the world's strongest economy for a long time, precisely because of very shifting transitional populations, whether that was slaves or immigrants, that we've always continually had movable human capital. The I think it's counterintuitive, but a lot of people think that by, if we're going to protect our economy, we have to keep all this out. And it's like, no, our own economy only works when we have people to take certain kinds of jobs. I mean, if you talk to anybody right now about the impact of extreme immigration enforcement in the services and agricultural industries, they will give you an earful about how awful and difficult it is to find Americans to do some of the work they need to get done and to
Because of
actually be profitable.
right, exactly. I was gonna say that like picking strawberries, which unfortunately I spoke to a woman who was in her 50s, and she'd been doing it since she was 15 years old, and she was in California. And she said she felt like she was an indentured servant because when she came to this country, and she came illegally, because I asked her, and she was provided a trailer, and she had to pay rent for that trailer. But because she wasn't making nearly enough, the payment for the rent for the trailer then became ginormous. And so she ended up having to stay there, and she saw no way out. So, I mean, imagine 15 years of age to, I don't know, I think she was in her mid 50s or late 50s, and she's still picking strawberries in the middle of the heat. And to think, like, we're so lucky and blessed in this country to have those strawberries at our table. But a lot of people don't think about those things, about the people who pick and the people who plant and the people, they're, yeah, their blood, sweat, and tears.
And it's been like that
And
since day one of the United States. We had slaves and we had to replace slaves.
well, not just the United States, because I've been at this immigration topic for a number of years, as you well know. And it's been like that all over the world since the inception of us being on this planet. There's been slavery, and there's been all colors of slaves. So let's get that straight. you know,
So,
so I think that's a really important topic. Maybe we can discuss that at a later date. I think this podcast has been exceptionally interesting and educative. So thank you so much, Ray, for sharing all this information. And I'd love to have you back on this program to discuss that, the historical anecdotes of why immigration still persists.
well, thank you. Absolutely.
Yeah. Is there anything you would like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I think we've touched on a lot of different things, and I think they've all centered around policy and how governments are behaving, whether it's in the history or it's during the pandemic. And I think right now, every level of government, particularly the federal government, but not just the federal, also state governments, are assuming emergency powers. And every time emergency powers are assumed, there's a risk of damaging democracy a bit. I mean, we mentioned the concentration camps, right? The Japanese internment camps. Those are absolutely were done under emergency powers. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that was like the one instance where you can be racist. It met the test of racial discrimination is okay.
Wow.
And there these powers, if people and everybody, your listeners, aren't paying attention and are just worried about the pandemic and are not holding the government accountable, our democracy's in peril too. And I think that's,
Absolutely.
I think the thing I would leave with everyone with is just make sure you're paying attention.
That's very interesting, and I appreciate you sharing that. Are you referring to Senate Report 93-549, where American citizens are treated as enemies of the state? And it was a law that was enacted in 1933.
Yeah,
Is that what you're talking
I
about?
mean, I
Yes,
mean, there's
yes.
there's sedition type laws like that. But I also think just generally, um, wartime powers,
Right.
national emergency powers, even within the Constitution, not even just the sedition laws. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's an ongoing debate. I mean, Trump just said the other day that he had total authority, and I think if people don't,
But he does, because the executive branch during a pandemic has authority, and that's the law that I'm referring to, the Senate Report 93-549. And if you haven't seen it, and for those listeners who haven't seen it and would like to read it, it's a document that is a little over 600 pages.
yeah,
And this document, I have done the research, extensive amounts of research, and I put it up on my Facebook page so people can see that, because it is true, the president does have the power during a global pandemic. Unfortunately, what people are not realizing is that in order for something to be called a global pandemic, 0.01% of the population of the whole globe, because we're this has affected the whole globe, 0.01% has to be affected, and we haven't reached that, not in the United States and not in on the globe at all. So
yeah.
he's using this
I
to enact this Senate report that went into law.
Yeah. Just to be clear, no, there are no laws whatsoever that supersede the Constitution in the United States.
There you
The,
go.
the Constitution is going to hold. So, first off, the police powers are seated exclusively delineated in the Constitution. They're given to the states. So all the things, about, Trump enforcing whether we open up or we don't open up and having enforcement of that, he doesn't have total authority. That's with the states. Even if they were to say that we need to do this because of economics and interstate commerce, that power is also enumerated, is one of the things enumerated in the Constitution, and that power lies within Congress. So there is no blanket way of saying that he has total authority that is actually constitutional. There's going to be some debate and there's going to be a fight about it, but it's not that clear. That is something that, even like with sedition laws that happened back under Thomas Jefferson's time. I mean,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
people fought that, and people said it was unconstitutional, and they basically rebelled against that. And I don't think it's that clear cut. I think it's open to interpretation. Every single law has to be interpreted. Every statute has to be interpreted. And I think the jury's out on that interpretation for the most part, but it's not out when it comes to police powers and interstate commerce. I think those things are very well clearly elucidated in the Constitution. I think that people have to remember that too.
Well, because we've never gone through a global pandemic, I think that people are taking advantage of different systems, and that's why we find ourselves within this situation. And again, it's 0.01% of the world to be an actual pandemic, so it's not even a pandemic, right? So
Yeah.
people could argue within that stratosphere. Um, and but within this report, I just want to reiterate that this law that was enacted in 1933, we've only used it 4 times. Okay. And this is the 5th time. And again, it is very true and very real that American citizens are treated as enemies of the state. And under the powers that delegated by these statutes, the president, the executive branch, may seize property, organize and control the means of production, seize commodities, assign military forces abroad, not within, but abroad. I just wanted to make that clear. Institute martial law, seize and control all transportation and communication, regulate operation of private enterprise, restrict travel, and in a plethora of particular ways, control the lives of all American citizens. And I think that's really important for people to read this. And if you want to look it up yourself, take
No,
your
no,
power
I'm
back.
very, very familiar with this. I think it's again, I just think that we have to remember that the Constitution has to also it can't we have to use the Constitution to fight back on how that's being interpreted or being exercised.
Right. And there are many individuals right now who are starting to speak to attorneys, groups of attorneys, law firms, because they want to sue the United States of America, the government. And it's all the way from governors to individuals and groups. So we need to take our power back. So I'm reaching out to listeners. I took the time to read that because I really want the listeners to understand that they have to take their power back and rise up. So thank you again so much, Ray, for being on this show. This podcast has been absolutely amazing, and I'd love to have you back next week if it's permissible. And everybody, thank you for listening. And as always, united we stand. Thank you so much for listening. Stay safe, subscribe, and review. We will come at you with many more topics, and remember, united we stand.